I think this plan could help also to focus the United States on the need to put more pressure on Putin. The Russian economy is suffering, inflation is high, growth is down. The Russians are having problems with recruitment to replace their soldiers. This is a good time to put pressure on Russia as well. So far, the Trump administration, of course, has put sanctions on the two big Russian oil giants, Rosneft and Lukoil. That's a good start, but obviously there's so much more that it can do.
Today on our program, we are joined by Shea, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security and Defense at Friends of Europe and former Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges at NATO. Welcome to our program.
Thank you for inviting me back.
Mr. Shea, it appears that the peace talks have stalled. Moscow seems unwilling to make concessions, while Kyiv refuses to withdraw its troops from Ukrainian-controlled areas of Donbas. How would you assess the state of these so-called negotiations at this point?
Well, it's not such a bad thing that the peace plan stalled because, of course, there are good peace plans and bad peace plans. And the original proposal that we saw from the US administration clearly was heavily influenced by Russian thinking. There was even a lot of Russian-looking language as well as Russian ideas in the text. It was very one-sided and very much in favor of Russia and the disadvantage of Ukraine. And in my view, that kind of peace may have produced a ceasefire for a temporary period, but certainly would not have put Ukraine in a position to defend itself and resist a future Russian aggression. So it's not such a bad thing when bad plans don't succeed, gives time to revise them, to turn them into better plans, more balanced plans, and plans which are much more likely to endure and provide a real peace. And I think that's what's been happening. The original 28-point plan has now been whittled down to, I understand, a 20-point plan. Lots of things that were clearly at the disadvantage of Ukraine have been dropped, like dramatic reductions in the size of its army, for instance. And the Europeans, of course, have been meeting with President Zelensky also to come up with their alternative Ukrainian plan to put on the table, which I think is a good way of also having more European influence on the process. So yes, for those who want an immediate peace in Ukraine by Christmas, all this is disappointing. But the key thing is that we have a just peace, we have a lasting peace, and we have a peace which is going to make it much more difficult for Russia to invade Ukraine in the future.
Since you already mentioned the European-Ukrainian peace plan, because indeed Ukrainian leader together with European leaders are working on this plan, and actually for me it's interesting that how realistic can plan this be for Russian side, because we know that Russia does not take into account any European proposal and the position of the EU and Europe in general.
Yes, it's a very good question. And my sense is that a Ukrainian-European peace plan is designed to influence Washington more than to influence Moscow by giving, first of all, as I said, the Europeans a greater role in the talks. They were a little bit left on the sidelines, weren't they, when Steve Witkoff and Kirill Dmitriev of Russia came up with the 28-point plan just a couple of weeks ago. And as the Americans in that plan were asking the Europeans to provide security for Ukraine, to provide for the economic reconstruction of Ukraine, to provide also for the equipment of the Ukrainian army. Well, you know, they say in the United States, no taxation without representation, which means that, you know, if Europe is being asked by Washington to do so much, then clearly it should have a voice in the talk. So I think it's a device to put more leverage on Washington to modify further the plan that the Americans Americans have. That's the first thing. But the second thing, of course, is that it has to also contain demands on Russia, which were notoriously absent from the earlier plan. I mean, the Russians also have to do things like, for example, withdraw some of their forces and some of their heavy equipment from the areas that they occupy in Ukraine, participate in reparations for the damaged Ukrainian economy, for instance, accept, obviously, a European reassurance force, which they've been refusing up until now. I mean, Kaja Kallas, the EU High Representative for the Common Foreign Security Policy, really pointed out that, we're asking Ukraine to do a lot of things, but what about Russia? And so I think this plan could help also to focus the United States on the need to put more pressure on Putin. The Russian economy is suffering, inflation is high, growth is down. The Russians are having problems with recruitment to replace their soldiers. This is a good time to put pressure on Russia as well. So far, the Trump administration, of course, has put sanctions on the two big Russian oil giants, Rosneft and Lukoil. That's a good start, but obviously there's so much more that it can do.
Do you think right now what kind of position is Donald Trump likely to take? Because in recent days we've heard from him that he criticized Kyiv, suggesting that President Zelensky had not even read the peace proposal, while saying that Russia already accept his peace plan. How should we...
Well, excuse me.
Yeah, how should we interrupt that message?
Well, I think that criticism was slightly unfair. There's been so many meetings in the last few days. For example, Ukrainian officials have been in Florida meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State and Trump officials. Steve Witkoff, of course, with Jared Kushner, have been in Moscow talking to Putin. It's a fast-moving picture, and I can understand that if you're President Zelensky, you don't just want to read the latest draft. You want to hear from your advisors who participated in these meetings, what has happened, why people have adopted a certain position, where there's flexibility, where there are red lines. This is what a leader needs to hear rather than simply read a text. He needs to know what is behind the text. And I think that President Zelensky was waiting, of course, to hear from his advisors, to have the full picture before taking a position. I think to sort of say that the president of Ukraine, a country which is the victim of aggression, is not interested in the latest draft of a peace plan is clearly wrong. And I think a little bit of courtesy here and a little bit of patience and realism is called for.
Do you see any risk that if Kyiv would not accept the peace proposal and the idea of seizing Donbas to Russia, that U.S. could potentially suspend intelligence sharing or slow down defense program and sending weapons through the Pearl program to Ukraine?
Well, yes, there is that risk. And we do know, of course, that in the past, when Trump has not been very happy with Zelensky, like after the White House meeting last February, he does take steps like suspend arms deliveries or put restrictions on the use of American weapons by Ukraine, for instance, long-range artillery, or refuse intelligence cooperation. But the good news is that after a couple of weeks, the United States has restored much of that, because clearly it needs to help Ukraine to stabilize its front line and then, of course, bring Moscow to the negotiating table. So we have to hope that any suspension, again, will be short-lived. Of course, also threatening to walk away is a good sort of pressure tactic to get concessions. But, Trump has committed himself to finding peace in Ukraine. He made that one of his big slogans on the campaign trail. He promised to get a peace, you remember, in 24 hours. He wants the Nobel Peace Prize, and he knows that if he walks away from the process, that Nobel Peace Prize is less likely to be going in his direction next October. And so to some degree, that would be a failure of Trump after all of the effort that he's put into negotiating between Moscow and Kyiv, it would make his assertion to be the great global peacemaker who solved so many conflicts look less credible as well. So I don't think, this is as easy an option for Trump as sometimes he makes it sound. But yes, I mean, we do know that the Americans are doing less to help Ukraine. The Europeans now need to buy the weapons from the United States through the NATO so-called Pearl prioritized list of Ukrainian requirements arrangement. We do know that the Europeans now have to bear the major responsibility. The Europeans could, I believe, replace substantially the US intelligence contribution. That's one thing they can do. And of course, the Europeans now are doing much more financially to support Ukraine. The Netherlands yesterday announced a new package of $700 million for Ukraine. Others in the last couple of weeks, Germany, Norway, have announced new packages as well. So this is really, yes, the hour of Europe. But as long as we can keep the United States involved, it's going to make things better. So we have to do our best. But of course, you're right. We live in very unpredictable times, unfortunately.
And indeed, talking about Europe's role, just yesterday during the meeting in London, French President Emmanuel Macron said that Western coalition holds strong cards at the negotiation table. What exactly might he be referring to?
Well, it's true that when people like President Trump say that Ukraine has no cards, that's not because Ukraine has no cards. It's because we have taken away from Ukraine many of the cards. For example, erratic financial assistance, delays in giving Ukraine weapons, also hesitation about giving Ukraine F-16s or tanks or long-range artillery, only to decide later on that it's okay to do so. I mean, clearly, if the European Union at its meeting next week in Brussels can finally decide to use 200 billion euros of frozen Russian assets here in Brussels and use that for a long-term loan to Ukraine. That would cover 2 to 3 years of Ukraine's financial and military requirements and allow more predictability in the system. The EU is working on now the 20th package of sanctions against Russia, for instance. The EU, by the way, is also talking to Canada and the UK to join in this scheme to use the frozen Russian central bank assets. So yes, I mean, Europe has not yet exhausted its arsenal of potential things that it can do to help. And hopefully, as I mentioned, the EU...
If we, you already mentioned that the European Council is planning to have the decision, or at least to discuss the idea of this reparation loan to Ukraine. How realistic do you think for now to have this decision? Because we see that Belgium doesn't want to join the program and still has some reflections that it will be the court against them from the Russian side and etc. That they also need strong security guarantees from other EU member states. Because for Kyiv now, this very important to receive the fund for the next years, to fund army, to fund defense programs, to buy weapons.
Yes, you're right. I mean, Belgium has got reservations, and some other EU member states are not entirely happy with this arrangement too, because of the precedent that it sets when it comes to the protection of sovereign assets in overseas bank accounts. But two things. Number one, the European Commission has done a great deal of legal work, complicated legal work over the last couple of weeks to try to come up with an arrangement which really will if you like, satisfy Belgium that any liability from future court cases will be mutualised and shared across the European Union, reducing the exposure of Belgium in particular, and hopefully all of those legal niceties, the EU is very good at doing this, will work. The second thing is what is the alternative? Because if the Russian assets are not used, then the alternatives are more debt by the European Union, like during the COVID crisis, mutualized debt to finance the next package of aid. And some countries like Germany are not particularly happy with that option, or the individual member states of the European Union simply have to find more money from their national budgets to support Ukraine. But a couple of weeks ago, the British magazine, The Economist, did an interesting analysis showing that financing of Ukraine over the next 3 years can take place with only 0.04% of EU GDP needing to be used, provided that, of course, everybody gets behind the effort, and not just a few countries like Denmark or Norway or Germany that often are doing the most. But if everybody gets behind this effort and shares this financial contribution, it's not as massive as sometimes it looks. But of course, as I come back to the conclusion, the Russian central bank assets is a difficult legal issue, but the alternatives are much more painful financially for the European member states. And hopefully that logic, Russia should be liable for all of the destruction that it has caused. That's a good moral and legal principle. Hopefully that will be the idea that prevails at the end of the day. But of course, let's wait for the meeting next week and see.
Another interesting topic about the Pearl program, because Italy just suspended its participation in the program, citing the possibility of a ceasefire, and that's actually the first European country to take such a step. And how should Kyiv read such messages, and what's your take on that?
Well, we hear these arguments. For example, Belgium has also said that, that using the Russian central bank assets would delay the peace process, and all of this should only be looked at after a peace has been agreed. But this argument that's doing less to Ukraine is somehow going to accelerate a peace is completely wrong. The Russians are the ones that reject all of these compromised peace plans and insist that only a plan 100% in their favor is acceptable. Putin wants to carry on the fighting. It's totally obvious that European security will be severely undermined by a collapse of Ukraine. And if Ukraine loses this conflict, it's about Europe as much as it's about the future of Ukraine. And so I hope that particularly Italy, where the Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni has been a supporter of Ukraine, will have a change of heart on this because fortunately other countries have increased their support for Pearl. For example, at the NATO foreign ministers meeting a few days ago, we heard that Australia and New Zealand were also now going to participate in this scheme as well. So it's good that other countries on the global scene also help out. And I mentioned that Pearl has gone from, in a couple of weeks, from 2 billion euros to 4 billion euros. It's still not enough. The Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, would like 1 billion euros a month for financing. But yes, Italy, I'm not pretending that it's great news, but it's to some degree offset and compensated by the fact that other countries have increased their contributions. And to all intents and purposes, in terms of supplying American weapons, spare parts and components quickly to Ukraine, it seems to be working, and it's the only game in town, frankly, at the present time.
Last topic which I want to cover today is, of course, the new national security strategy of the US. What's your assessment of these documents, especially in terms of its implication for Ukraine and other European countries?
Well, how seriously to take it, really, I think is the question, because it's not a security strategy. It doesn't look like any national security strategy from the United States that I looked at during my years as a NATO official. It's more about ideology and, if you like, domestic affairs. Then it's about objective assessments of threat and objective plans to deal with those threats, which you would expect from a national security strategy. To my mind, it's not a very professional job. It seems to have been put in place by a small group of people in a little bit of a hurry. And, some of its conclusions, like Europe is suffering from civilizational erasure, or being very soft on Russia, or seeing Europe as a democratic ally of the United States as somehow a bigger problem for Washington and China and Russia, simply don't make sense. It seems also to focus exclusively on internal threats like mass migration, for example, or what the US considers to be a denial of free speech, or a lack of sort of vitality in Europe as the threats, when I think most European analysts would think that Russia is a much, much bigger threat than those things. Also, I think it's based on a lot of false information. For example, the United States says that migration is a threat, but the American economy over the last 200 years has grown massively because of migration and drawing in foreign talent. Without it, the American economy suffers. Secondly, Europe has done a lot over the last couple of years to reduce the level of migration, particularly countries like Italy or Greece, where it is really much, much smaller. So the US is sort of talking about yesterday's problem rather than today. Europe also is spending a lot on its defense now. So accusing it of being a free rider on the United States, that may have been true 10 years ago, but certainly not true today, with NATO countries going to 5% of GDP. So I could carry on in this vein, Sonia, but, to my mind, what are the objective facts on which, these rather dramatic conclusions about European civilizational erasure are founded? So, there are some security strategies which really do determine the future. If you look at, for example, National Security Council 68 at the beginning of the Cold War, in 1948. That was a key document that determined the future of the US foreign policy for the next 50 years. But frankly, Sonia, there are some national security strategies that are forgotten rightly a couple of days after they're published and have less influence. So let's wait and see. But clearly, it's not great news. But I think in Europe, we need to be calm about that, not overreact. Of course, point out the inconsistencies and the errors. But also, of course, as I've said previously, when you've invited me onto your program, Europe has to realize that it needs to depend increasingly on its own resources and take care of its own security, Ukraine being part of that.
And my last question on this, because it's really interesting for me in this so-called then strategy, we see particularly the section on restraining further NATO enlargement. And do you see this as a potential concession to President Putin? Because we know that he wanted to hear this.
Yes, it would be, and I hope this is not a decision that NATO collectively will take. The United States has been a great supporter of the open door, and indeed it was the Clinton administration, the United States, that put NATO enlargement on the table for the first time. I was there at NATO, and it was against the resistance of many Europeans at the time. It was an American idea, driven largely by the United States, and has been a great success story for Europe. And what does that mean, for example, for countries in the Western Balkans, like Kosovo, for example, that might wish to join NATO at a later date? It's not just about Ukraine. It's been a great success story. Russia has recognized in many European treaties the right of countries to choose an alliance. And basically what the US would be doing is to say to Russia, look, you guys have a veto over NATO, because if you don't like anything about NATO, we'll immediately take it into account and change NATO, which actually would mean that Russia would be the next member state of NATO, paradoxically, at least in a kind of secret way, because Russia would then have that voice in NATO decision making. It would have that veto, which NATO has always denied it. So, to my mind, I hope that this is a momentary expression of discontent, but that cooler heads in Washington, particularly the U.S. Congress, which should be involved in this debate, will keep the open door policy of NATO intact.
Mr. Shea, thank you very much for our conversation and for this discussion and for your insights.
Thank you once again for inviting me, and all the best for Ukraine. Fossa.